Welcome to DCF Investigations. The fog rolls thick off the Atlantic, clinging to the cobblestones of New Bedford, Massachusetts. It is a city of hard-working fishermen, of salt and diesel, a place where the ocean gives life, but also takes it away. But in the spring of 1988, it wasn't the sea that the people of New Bedford learned to fear. It was the road. Specifically, the long, lonely stretches of asphalt that cut through the dark pine forests surrounding the city. Route 140, Interstate 195. To the casual traveler, they were just waypoints on a map. But to the women of Weld Square, they became a graveyard. Between 1988 and 1989, a shadow moved through this city. It preyed on the forgotten, the addicted, the women who walked the night because they had nowhere else to go. One by one, they vanished into the fog, only to reappear months later, discarded like refuse along the highway embankments. 9 bodies, 2 missing, and a killer who, to this day, has never seen the inside of a prison cell. This is the story of the New Bedford Highway Killer. To understand the horror that gripped this city, you have to understand the atmosphere of 1988. New Bedford was the whaling capital of the world once, a city of immense wealth. But by the late 80s, the economy was shifting. The fishing industry was tough, dangerous work, and on the streets, a different kind of industry had taken hold. Heroin and cocaine were ravaging the community. Weld Square was the epicenter. It was a place where neon signs flickered over broken dreams. A few blocks where women stood on corners, not because they wanted to, but because the addiction demanded it. One of these women were mothers, daughters, and sisters. They had families who loved them, but they had fallen into the cracks of a society that was all too ready to look the other way. The terror began quietly. It almost always does. It started with a disappearance that didn't make the front page. In early 1988, women began to vanish. But in a transient community, where people often dropped off the grid for days or weeks, the alarm bells didn't ring immediately. Let's go back to the days leading up to the first discovery. It is July 3rd, 1988. A hot, humid Sunday. The holiday weekend traffic is heavy on Route 140. A woman pulls her car over to the side of the road in Freetown, just north of New Bedford. She needs a moment of privacy, so she steps over the guardrail and walks a few yards into the brush. She stops. Something in the tall grass doesn't look right. The shape is wrong. It's too pale, too still. As she moves closer, the realization hits her with the force of a physical blow. It is a human body. The police arrive and cordon off the scene. The remains are skeletal, decomposed by the summer heat and the ravages of animal activity. Forensics in 1988 were not what they are today. There was no mitochondrial DNA testing, no advanced genetic genealogy. Identification was a slow, grueling process involving dental records. It would take months to put a name to the bones. Deborah Medeiros. She was 30 years old, a mother. She'd been missing since May 27th. Her boyfriend told police they had argued, and she had stormed out of their apartment, walking into the night. She never walked back in. Deborah was the first. She would not be the last. To just weeks later, on July 30th, the nightmare repeated itself. 2 motorcyclists were riding along the embankment of Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, a few miles away. They spotted something off the shoulder. Another body, nude, discarded. This was Nancy Paiva. She was 36, a mother of 2 daughters. Nancy wasn't a sex worker, but she struggled with the demons of addiction. She was last seen on July 7th, walking away from a bar called Whisper's Pub in the South End. She had fought with her boyfriend, a man known to police as a heroin dealer. She walked out into the cool night air, perhaps looking for a ride, perhaps just looking to clear her head. She vanished into the dark. When she was found, she was positioned similarly to Deborah Medeiros. On her back, exposed. It was a message. By late summer, a chilling pattern had emerged, but the public was largely unaware. The police, however, were beginning to sweat. 2 bodies found near major highways, both women known to frequent the same circles in New Bedford. Both strangled. Then came the fall, and with the falling leaves came more discoveries. November 8th. A highway crew clearing brush on the Reed Road ramp of I-195 finds the remains of Deborah Greenlaw DeMello. She was 35, a mother from Brockton who had come to New Bedford. She had been missing since July, November 29th. A hunter's dog runs into the woods off the same Reed Road ramp. The dog returns, agitated. The hunter follows. He finds the body of Dawn Mendes, 25 years old. She had been missing since September 4th. She had gone out to buy cigarettes and never returned for her daughter's birthday party the next day. 3 days later, December 1st, a search dog in Freetown, working a grid along Route 140, signals his handler. Another body, Deborah McConnell, 25. Missing since May. 9 days after that, December 10th, 2 men riding ATVs in a gravel pit off Reed Road find the body of Rochelle Clifford Dopiarala, 28. She had been missing since April. The city was now in a full-blown panic. The suspect of the day became a grim joke among the press corps. Every day the newspapers screamed with new theories. Women in Weld Square began carrying knives. Some stopped working entirely. The streets emptied out as the sun went down. The sheer density of the dumping grounds was staggering. Most of the bodies were found within a few miles of each other, clustered around the exits and on-ramps of I-195 and Route 140. This wasn't just a dumping ground, yet it was the killer's backyard. He knew these roads. He knew which pull-offs were invisible from the highway at night. He knew exactly how long he had before the headlights of an oncoming truck would sweep across the guardrail. The investigation was massive, but it was flawed from the start. In 1988, serial killer was a term that law enforcement in smaller cities associated with the likes of Ted Bundy or the son of Sam, not something that happened in their own jurisdiction. The initial response was slow. Because the victims were sex workers and addicts, their disappearances were often written off as lifestyle choices. The critical 48-hour window was lost in almost every single case. Forensically, the detectives were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The bodies were often skeletal by the time they were found. Honestly, there was no biological material to swab for DNA. Any fibers or hairs found on the victims had been subjected to rain, wind, and insects for months. The killer was ghost-like, leaving no fingerprints, no shell casings, no witnesses. But that didn't mean there were no suspects. The list of names that passed through the interrogation rooms was long, but 2 men stood out. 2 men who would become the faces of the investigation. The first was Kenneth Ponte. Ponte was a local attorney, a man who should have been a pillar of the community. but he had a dark side. He was deeply embedded in the drug subculture of New Bedford. He represented many of the women in court, and he was known to socialize with them in Weld Square. Ponte became the prime suspect when it was discovered he had a connection to Rochelle Clifford Dopiarala. But Rochelle had been beaten to death, unlike the others who were strangled. Ponte had represented her in a rape case just before she vanished. The police squeezed him hard. They dug up his driveway. They searched his home. They hauled him in front of a grand jury. In August 1990, Kenneth Ponte was indicted for the murder of Rochelle Clifford Dopiarala. It seemed like the breakthrough the city had been praying for. But the case was weak. It was circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. No eyewitnesses placing her in his car that night. The charges were dropped a year later for lack of evidence. Ponte moved to Florida, then returned to New Bedford, living under a cloud of suspicion until he died in 2010. Was he the killer? Or was he just a sleazy lawyer who got too close to the fire? And then there was Anthony DeGrazia. If Ponte was the white-collar suspect, DeGrazia was the blue-collar nightmare. A muscular stone mason with a violent reputation, DeGrazia was known on the streets as Flat Nose. He had a history of assaulting sex workers. He liked to choke them. DeGrazia fit the profile perfectly. He was strong enough to strangle a victim without a struggle. He drove a van. He knew the back roads and the construction sites. He was arrested in 1989 for a series of rapes and assaults on women in the area. The police were convinced he was their man for the murders as well. But again, the physical evidence wasn't there. DeGrazia was released on bail. He didn't stay free for long. In July 1990, just a month after his release, DeGrazia was found dead under a picnic table in his girlfriend's backyard. He had overdosed on pills. The district attorney called it a suicide, implying it was the guilt of a killer catching up to him. DeGrazia's family insisted he was murdered to silence him. With his death, the most promising lead in the investigation went cold. But the theories didn't stop with Ponte and DeGrazia. As the years dragged on, the speculation grew darker and more complex. One of the most persistent and fascinating theories involves a connection to a killer across the ocean, the Lisbon Ripper. New Bedford has a massive Portuguese population. The cultural ties between the city and Portugal are deep, with people traveling back and forth constantly. In the early 90s, a series of gruesome murders occurred in Lisbon, Portugal. Sex workers were being killed and disemboweled. The timing was suspicious when the New Bedford killings stopped in 1989. The Lisbon killings started shortly after. The FBI actually sent agents to Lisbon, and Portuguese detectives came to New Bedford. The theory was that the killer was a Portuguese national who had been working in New Bedford, perhaps in the fishing industry or construction, and then fled back home when the heat got too high. In 2011, this theory exploded back into the headlines when a young man on a Portuguese reality show claimed his father was the Lisbon Ripper. The father, José Pedro Guedes, was arrested and reportedly confessed. He even hinted at crimes in other countries. But the details didn't match. The Lisbon Ripper mutilated his victims with a knife. The New Bedford Highway Killer was a strangler who left bodies intact. The psychological profiles were different. The connection, while tantalizing, was likely a coincidence. Then there is the theory of Daniel Tavares Jr. Tavares is a convicted killer who murdered his own mother in 1991. He lived in New Bedford. right in the heart of the danger zone. In fact, he lived within walking distance of where one of the missing women, Gail Botelho, was last seen. Years later, while in prison, Tavares began to talk. He claimed responsibility for the highway killings. He knew details about where bodies were buried. He was eventually convicted of killing Gail Botelho, whose remains were found in his former backyard. But was he the highway killer? Tavares is a psychopath who loves attention. He has confessed to crimes he didn't commit before just to get perks in prison. While he is a proven killer, many investigators believe he is taking credit for another monster's work. So, where does that leave us? It has been over 35 years. The highways are still there. The traffic still rushes by, oblivious to the history in the soil. The families of Deborah Medeiros, Nancy Paiva, and the 7 other women are still waiting. They are waiting for a phone call that may never come. 2 women, Christina Montero and Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, are still missing. Their bodies have never been found. They are ghosts in the machine, suspended in time. The tragedy of the New Bedford Highway Killer case is not just the loss of life. It is the failure of the system. It is the story of how we value some victims less than others. If 9 college students had vanished from a university campus, the National Guard would have been called out. But because these were women from Weld Square, the response was too little, too late. Today, the case is cold, but it is not closed. Modern DNA technology is advancing every day. Evidence that was useless in 1988 might hold the key in 2026. A single hair, a microscopic skin cell, could finally unmask the monster. Until then, the killer remains a phantom. He may be an old man now, living quietly in a nursing home in Florida. He may be dead, buried in a grave not far from his victims. Or he may still be out there, driving the highways, watching the fog roll in. This is DCF Investigations. We have to ask, do you believe the killer stopped, or did he just move on? And does the fact that the main suspects are dead mean justice can never be served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe and keep your eyes on the road.